Friends, if we are patient enough and develop sufficient techniques, I think it is possible for us to get down below our rational, business-like, everyday minds to find resources that come to us from millennia back in our relationship to the earth. And the more we develop the products of civilization or the artifacts of civilization, the farther away we get from the fundamental ground of our being. This is one of the perennial conflicts human beings have faced to get down below the surface reality of things and to identify what it is that truly sustains us as a life form. We often think that it's our capacity to reason or our capacity to think, and yet reasoning is a very recent development in the long evolutionary history in which we've lived. And I'd go so far as to say reason can be a very superficial thing too. It's a new phenomenon. We are really governed much more by those things that we do not understand than we are governed by things we claim to understand. And we are motivated much more by forces below what we would call our consciousness, much more so than we are guided by our conscious life. And one way to think about this, or to illustrate that point, is to think of how little impact our reason has on our inherited prejudices and traditions. Just think of some things like racism or gender stereotypes or ableism. We inherit over centuries attitudes and frames of mind, dispositions, prejudices. No matter how we change our thinking, we often find that in a crisis, we may act as though we never had a thought. And it is extremely difficult to take a rational idea and to change a behavior. If you've been in therapy, you know that's true. And it's very difficult to take a rational idea and change a structure or a system, a human system. It often takes eons for change to take place in that way, hundreds of years to enter into common acceptance. Because most of the time, human beings, you and I, act out of very different motivations. And this is particularly true for one persistent, erroneous idea, which most of us hold, and almost always to our own detriment. And that idea goes like this, that we human beings are the end of the world. We are the culmination of evolution. We are sufficient unto ourselves. We are the most intelligent life form ever created. And we get stuck in that idea. But the earth does not operate that way, because the earth is a process. And the word process has many connotations and meanings. What I mean when I say that the earth is a process is that it is unfinished. It moves. It's never been all set. It was not ever predetermined that human beings would arrive on Earth. We are the product of an evolutionary process, and no one knew what would come to be, nor will any creature ever know what will come to be. So this morning, using an insight from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, I would translate process to be a constantly emerging newness. That's what process meant to Whitehead, a constantly emerging newness. And the most important thing about this concept is its creativity, you see. The constant emergence of something new. Things come together after having been together before, or they come together in a radically new way. Something breaking out like a volcano, other times taking eons to develop, new arrangements, new styles, new forms, new relationships, new creatures. And this is what process is, you see, a constant emergence of things that are new and often unpredicted. This is the way of life. This is the way in which we live. Just think about the situation we find ourselves in today. Who could have imagined 2-3 months ago that the world would be facing the issues that we face today? Yes, there have been other pandemics and plagues, but this is a different kind of pandemic. This is a pandemic that affects the whole known world and will have aftershocks for a long time to come. It came out of pre-existing patterns, creating its own pattern, which we are trying to understand and adapt to and to live with. But you see, the most important thing about process is the creativity that resides in it. All of those creative energies and forces, we did not make them. They made us. Creativity is going on in the world and in the universe all the time. We are creatures and products of those forces. But creativity always takes precedence over us. It preceded us, and it will continue long after we human beings are gone. We cannot destroy it, ultimately. Life is always more than any individual expression of it. And that seems reasonable because this process was here long before we arrived, you see. We know this on some level, I believe. This is why the female or the mother of any species will often produce young at fatal risk to itself and is willing in protecting those young to sacrifice her own or its own life for those young. This is true not only of mammals and birds, it is true even of insects. How does that get wired into living things, you might ask? I think it's wired into us because we are aware on some level that the most important thing is the emergence of something new, the possibilities that reside in the next generation, in the next set of life forms. And I think that it is that impulse that I would call hope. Hope as a way of being in the world. Hope is not something you have. Hope is really something you are. Another way of saying this is that hope is the human expression of the survival of the species, the self-sacrifice for the future. It's a kind of awareness. And whether we are conscious of it or not, it's an awareness of the fact that what has been is not now, and what is now need not continue into the future. We cannot predict what will be, no matter how good it is now. It may continue and issue into something even more glorious than it is now. No matter how bad it is now, a process continues, and nothing is preconditioned and limited. Some manifestations of harm or evil do get washed out in new relationships. There's a change, there's a healing, there's a reset. or a redirection. Sometimes these forms develop into even greater harm or evil. This is all a complicated way, and I think it is complicated way of saying that hope is not a wish or a dream or a hunger. Those are what I would call examples of optimism. Optimism always anticipates a different or a more favorable outcome than the one we have. But that's not what hope is. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Hope is built into the very fabric of life, of being alive. Maybe you call it an instinct, but it is based on the fact of life as an ongoing process in which new things emerge, new things that may be good or not. Hope keeps growing and developing as life does. Many years ago now, the psychiatrist Carl Menninger said that where there is hope, there is life. It's another way of saying what I'm trying to say today. Hope is basic to life. We cannot get along without it. It is our reverence for the powers that create and sustain us day to day. It is our reverence and appreciation and even devotion and dedication to that which is more than we are. Where there is hope, there is life. And yet, there is a hitch. And even the ancient Greeks knew that there was a hitch. They knew that hope was problematic. They knew that hope is always yoked to despair. The philosopher Nietzsche said of this, "It is worse than disaster, hope, because you can deal with a disaster and suffer it, but the problem with hope is that it keeps you suffering," close quote. That is a very powerful observation, not original to Nietzsche, but very old, going back to earliest civilizations like the Greeks. We do go on suffering with hope. And that's why the Greeks considered hope challenging. In their myth of Pandora's box, they claimed that the box was full of all kinds of things, good and ill. And for her own reasons, Pandora poured out on the world all of the contents of her box, save one thing. She clamped the lid over it, leaving only one thing in the box, and that one item was hope. Because she knew if she let hope loose, it would be so very painful. There would be more awareness of suffering. If we didn't want the suffering or an awareness of the suffering, if we don't want to catch any of the vision of possibilities and new things, then we do not want hope. If you don't want to suffer too long, you will throw away your hope. If you take hope, though, take it along with all of its ideals and its suffering, this is really its most powerful form. Hope acknowledges the suffering of the world and at the same time gives you the strength to see your way through the suffering. We desire many things. We are bound to be disappointed and defeated even by not getting them. If we didn't want much, we wouldn't suffer much. If we didn't care, we would not suffer over loss. If you did not hope, it would not matter. But the paradox of hope always is that it hurts to have hope or to be hopeful, and yet it is that same hope that leads you on and through it. Where there is hope, there is life. As long as you hope, there will continue to be life, even as we know it and treasure it, and seek to have it grow and develop. But where there is no hope, there is death, because hopelessness is death. I hesitate to give you an illustration of this because I understand that illustrations are always limited, and what might make sense to one person may make zero sense to someone else, but yet I'm going to risk that. Research laboratories often conduct experiments on rats because rats are so very much like human beings. I won't elaborate. I'll let you maybe chuckle and think about that yourself. But they put some rats in a tub of water from which they could not escape. And after they had been swimming in the water for a while and seemed near exhaustion, they took them out of the water, kept them out for a while, put them back in, let them stay longer than they did the last time, removed them again, did this 3 or 4 times. And then they took all of those rats and some newer ones and put them all in a tub. And the rats that had had the previous experience of being taken out when they were near exhaustion all continued to swim for 3 days. And the rats that were newly introduced to the tub died within an hour. Hope is not a trivial thing. I think it could, in a way, see those rats through those moments of total futility only because they had been taught or trained or experienced what I would call a drive for hope, a basic human drive for hope. Now, I do not advocate experimenting this way. I do not support this cruelty even to animals or testing animals in this way. But it does illustrate a point that if we are given cause for hope, even on a basic animal level, we stand a better chance of living. Hope has been the substance of most religion and philosophy for many, many millennia. When life has become difficult here on the earth, many of these religions then project their hope into another life. If earth is terrible, heaven will rescue us. It will all be taken care of later on, you see. If we are bad people, a Savior will come who will redeem us of our inner and innate sinfulness and debauchery. And we project hope onto something else or onto something or someone else. And all of these wishes are driven by fear and desire. We are afraid of something in particular, or we desire something different than what we have now. And we say that we hope for something particular or different. But I do not think that that is hope in its deepest, most primal, and earthly sense. When I began the sermon some minutes ago, I said that we needed to find resources that come to us from millennia back in our relationship to the earth. And one of those resources is hope as a kind of active patience, awaiting for some new emergence, an earthly kind of hope, not a particular outcome, but for something new to come that may help us, or it may not help us. And we often find this kind of hope in people who become witnesses of hope, hope which sustains because we have been here before and we have come through. It's a kind of hope in the creative process that made us and has brought us this far along. However dark and futile it may seem to us, has brought us this far and will not end. This kind of hope is a faith in a constantly emerging newness and a belief that it is meaningful. And I think we would be faithless indeed if we did not acknowledge the emergence of hope in our own time. Who could have ever predicted that a person like Nelson Mandela could have suffered the oppression and cruelty that he suffered in his long life by virtue of who he was as a human being, only eventually to be freed and to become the most important liberating leader in the history of South Africa and even the world? Who could have predicted this? Most of us would have said that he would have died only in despair. Who could have imagined that someone like Václav Havel, who was the first president of the Czech Republic, a political dissident and playwright, himself imprisoned by the communists for many, many years in his native Czechoslovakia, lived to be released and to be the beacon of a new democracy in Eastern Europe? Who could have imagined this beforehand? And yet we wait in this emergence of possibility in the long pageant of life for something that may redeem us. They are persons, examples, who experienced what they did and emerged to become beacons of hope in a terrifying and bleak century. Who will be the witnesses of hope in our current situation? We are already well aware of prospects who have no chance of becoming such witnesses. Who will be the heroes and heroines who will emerge from this global pandemic in medicine, in government, in the economy, in our countries, maybe even in our families, who will teach us a new way to live, who developed, in the words of Lionel Trilling, night vision, the capacity to see in the darkest moments of human history glimmers of light and glimmers of hope. And they lead the way for us to what is really no better word than I can think of it as our salvation. Havel said, hope is an orientation of the human spirit, an orientation of the human heart. It is not the conviction that something will turn out right, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. That's a brave kind of hope. It's a way of being hope, not having hope, but of being hope. Can we have faith in this constantly emerging newness, in this great privilege we live in called life? Can we afford not to? Can we afford not to? I don't think so. Be blessed, my friends. Hold fast, hold each other, and we will make it. Amen.